Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and to your President, John McCulloch, a very warm thank you for that introduction and background. I'm very privileged to be here today. John called me and said, will you give a keynote? And oh, by the way, can you do the after-dinner speech at the gala dinner? And I said, yeah, okay, why me? A little conversation took place and I agreed. And it is a privilege at the age of 81 to be pulled out of the wardrobe, dusted down, and put in front of this august body of communications experts whose knowledge will leave me static. This morning I'm going to give you a cook's tour of my career in communications. And it really started as a boy of 8 years old. And my father, who was a communicator, gave me a crystal radio. A little box with a cat's whisker on a crystal. And that was the start of my interest in communications. So I'm going to give you a bit of background. I'm going to talk about my experience in the desert in the Middle East when I was on secondment to an Arab army. And it's nice to see one of my colleagues over there who was a founder member of an amateur radio station in that Arab army, and I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll talk about military communications and my experience in using them, managing them, procuring them, and trialing them. Very broad experience of every type of communications stuff. Generators, batteries, aerials, antennas, you name it, I've been involved in my life. Particularly emergency services communications, and that's where I came across John McCulloch when he was the technical director in the Royal Ulster Constabulary in the Skid Road in Belfast. And I spent many hours with him and going to funny places in the province. And then I'll talk a little bit about security systems and my time in GCHQ in Cheltenham. My aim today is to try and encourage the youth to follow all you elderly people. When I look around, it's quite frightening that the average age must be about 80. And I hope I can whet the appetite of the youngsters who watch this online brief. It is a very exciting environment, and I've had a magical career based on communications. So when I left school at 16 with 3 O-levels, I wanted to be a chemist, but I ended up in Timothy White's the chemist shop, but not as a chemist, but as an articled trainee manager. I then got fed up of that, long hours, poor pay, and I marched into the recruiting office in York and said I'd like to be an officer in the army. They said, 3 O-levels, not a chance. But I tell you what, we'll train you to be a technician, we'll get you into the army, take the Queen's shilling, and see what happens after that. So I said, okay. I served in Germany, Northern Ireland, and the Middle East. The communication spectrum is there that I covered, and a lot of stuff in the intelligence world. After I retired from the army after 33 years, I was appointed the senior military officer in GCHQ, responsible for the protective side of government security. And I'm not going to talk about signals intelligence at all. It's not my remit, but I can talk eloquently about protective communications, cyber, information assurance, information security, computer security, you name it, cryptography, and international interoperability. And I belong to a number of international committees dealing with interoperability, particularly in NATO. And since I left GCHQ, I've been running my own cyber security company. Somebody said to me earlier, oh, it's good that you're a consultant. I said consultancy to me is a dirty word, because consultants will come into your company, they'll interview everybody, they'll write a report and tell you what you already know. I'm a strategic advisor. I go into companies and tell them what they don't want to know and become very unpopular but it does help them get onto the right track. My family background is interesting. My father was the Merchant Navy radio officer on the SS Georgic during the war. He got bombed in Alexandria, suffered mentally and physically for a number of years, but ended up as a chief telegraphist in the Yorkshire Evening Press in York, where my grandfather was the publisher. But he was also an amateur radio enthusiast, and that's his call sign there. I have a picture of him at his little station in his home in York all those years ago. Sadly, he passed away, and I was privileged to pass his radio equipment to his GP, who received it extremely gratefully. My brother, my late brother, was an RAF pilot officer, and he was one of the first air electronic officers on the V-bombers, the Victors, Valets, and Vulcans. And he was my hero. He was a shining example of success. Sadly, he was taken at the age of 20 in a terrible accident after being promoted to flight lieutenant. Myself, my father's experience in the Navy told me that I should go in the Navy as well. And at the age of 11, I was sent to a naval boarding school, the Royal Hospital School at Holbrook in Suffolk, where I suffered for 5 years an austere, bullied, cold, miserable, starving life. And I came out of it at 16, and as I said, I went into retail. Army officer and a Crown servant. My roles, I was a radio technician light in the Royal Corps of Signals, and I trained in Catterick in 1965-66, and I served in UK, Germany and the Middle East. I was then asked if I would like to stay on in the Middle East, and the commanding officer said, no, you're not good enough to be a soldier anymore. We're sending you back to the United Kingdom to be commissioned to be an officer. And my eyes lit up. My ambition was being granted to me. And I went to Mons Officer Cadet School, did 5 months training with, and I was 28 at this time, and all the other lads there were 18, 19, gazelles, fit, hungry, and I had to keep up with them. But I passed. And I went to become a troop commander in a regiment in Germany with a radio relay troop responsible for the line of communications from Zeebrugge to the 1st British Corps combat zone. And so the communications I provided were 12 channel over radio relay and provided the communications to move reinforcements from the UK to the 1st British Corps in Germany in wartime to stop the 12-foot Russians overrunning us. I then did an in-service degree, a telecommunications engineering management course at the Royal School of Signals in Blandford, then became a trials officer, testing all the kit, and then ho-ho, I was appointed as a major in 1977 to be the chief instructor of our trade training school. And there, in my trainees, were radio telegraphists. And these were guys, the creme de la creme of operators in the Corps, who did Morse to 28 words a minute. They were really good. They could put up antennas, they could do muffs, luffs, you name it, and they generally moved up the ranks to commissioning at the 22-year point. But that was a very rewarding time. Brigade Signal Squadron Commander in Colchester, then became a scientist in the intelligence world, modelling Soviet electronic warfare equipment, attacking British equipment. Then Ptarmigan came along, and I know some of you will be familiar with Ptarmigan, an area communications system, a bit like BT on wheels. Lots of communication nodes, access nodes. Having done the trials, seen it fielded in Germany, I was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel to provide system support to that system. Then back into electronic warfare as a project manager in MIOD London, and I lived in London unaccompanied for 6 years and commuted back to Herefordshire at weekends. Then on promotion to colonel, I took over all the battlefield information systems. And I won't go into that, but that was an exciting time. And then the pinnacle of my career in the Army, GCHQ. And I have to say that was the most fascinating, interesting, challenging, but satisfying job in my life. The people I worked with were amazing people. They had 7 brains. And it was a lovely environment to work in. So, going back to my Army days, in 1967, I'm sitting in a regiment in Germany, the 1st Armoured Division, and a notice came up on Part 1 orders. Wanted, volunteers, Crucial Omen Scouts. And I thought, that sounds interesting. So I put my bid in, and whoop, 2 weeks later, I was on a VC-10 to Bahrain, and then on an Argosy from Bahrain to Sharjah, into the desert, into the Crucial Omen Scouts. A paramilitary force funded by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, with 2,000 Arab soldiers and Arab officers, and the British officers and NCOs training them. And their aim was to stop illegal immigration, drug dealing, patrolling the desert, stopping tribal conflicts. A fascinating time because oil had been discovered and wealth had come into the States, and it needed proper protection. And the force provided that. And that was a very exciting time for me. That's the Trucial States now. You're all familiar with the United Emirates, as it's now called. The Trucial Omen Scouts were the founders of the Emirates Army of today. Our headquarters was in Sharjah, a small headquarters. There was a signal squadron providing all the communications, HF, a little bit of VHF. There was a motor transport squadron, a boys' school, and that's what I'm going to dwell on in a minute, 4 infantry companies and 4 desert intelligence officers. In those days, there were no hotels, there was no Burj Al Arab, there was no world island, there was nothing, just lots of little white huts and little Arabs running around doing their own business. That's me as a corporal, and the gentleman sat with me was Staff Sergeant Murad Hassan. Interesting that I became a full colonel, and he also became a full colonel. He did some training in the Royal Signals at Blandford, and then went on to be the Signals Officer-in-Chief in the UAE Armed Forces. A nice historical picture, that. That was our headdress, our uniform, and we dressed like Arabs. We ate like Arabs in the field. We spoke like Arabs with the Arab soldiers, and we ate like Arabs. Those are the 7 states of the Trucial States. Abu Dhabi, the biggest of the states and the richest, and it still is the richest. Sheikh Mohammed Zayed was put into power with the aid of the Trucial Omen Scouts. His brother, Sheikh Shakbud, had not a clue about money. And oil revenue in the 70s was pouring in the 60s and 70s. And Sheikh Shakbud, when he was the ruler, used to say, how rich am I? And he would turn to his acolytes and say, how rich am I? Can I see how much money I've got? And they used to send the truck down to the bank to wheel up the gold and all the money and show him, and it would all go back again. Sheikh Mohammed Zayed, he was a visionary and decided to invest in the country and the people. And Abu Dhabi, as you see it today, is not as vulgar as Dubai, and that's no insult to Dubai, but he invested heavily in culture, in buildings, in highways, and Sheikh Rashid, who was the ruler of Dubai, followed, but he was a spendthrift. And he ran out of money, he ran out of oil. And it's now tourism is his big thing. And that's why he developed about 500 miles of beach and entertainment for tourists. Sharjah, Ajman, Al Quwain, Ras Al Khaimah, Al Fujairah are the smaller states and were not oil rich. Our camps were connected by HF radio, and our headquarters in Sharjah had to work to a village in the plains, the desert plains called Manama, a base in the mountains in Masafi, Al Ain, Fort Jahili on the Saudi, Oman, UAE border, Ras Al Khaimah, the Dubai Palace, the Abu Dhabi Palace, and the Desert Intelligence Officers. And it was a privilege to go to the palace to, in my role as looking after the radios, to go to the palace and see the luxurious style in which they lived. And subsequent visits with my colleague over there to the States to go on reunions, we were wined and dined by these sheikhs. They never forget the people that helped them, and there's some wonderful relationships developed there. Right, how did they communicate? Well, they communicated in Morse. Did they use voice? Well, very little, because the Arab boys couldn't speak English, and they used to go to the classroom and learn the phonetic alphabet. And you could walk by the classrooms and you hear Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Echo, Foxtrot, and then they were taught the Morse code. And then they were given messages to send. And here's a little Arab boy, he's only about 14, sending a message in Morse code to the outstations. And they were brilliant. They could do in excess of 30 words a minute. Beautiful. Duty operator, he had managed about 8 boys on a shift, and we, the Brits, the signals team, had to manage the antennas, dipoles, inverted dipoles, every time of antenna you could think of. Here's another Arab working away on his Morse key. The radio in use was a C11 R210, a British radio, which was procured for the British Army, but used extensively by the Troop 11 Scouts. We had a dhow. It was the fastest dhow in the Arabian Gulf, which we called it then, not the Persian Gulf. And it could outrun any boat or any other dhow in the Gulf. And it was there to stop smuggling, particularly people smuggling. And what you see in the channel today is not new. It's been going on all over the world since early days. Land Rover borne communications, the same, the C11 R210. Lorries, mainly operated by the squadrons and the Arab soldiers in the field. Now, when I arrived there, I was told there had been an amateur radio station. And the gentleman at the back there was the founder member of that radio station, MP4TAC. And I decided at that time I was not somebody to spend all the time in the bar in sunny climes, because we only worked from 7 o'clock in the morning till 1 every day, except for the weekend, that was off. So we had lots of spare time. So I decided to resurrect MP4TAC based on the work that my colleague had done in the past. And I found a D11 HF radio, 300 watt output as a transmitter. C19 HF receiver I found in the stores. I got them up and working, and with the aid of my yeoman of signals, I put together an inverted V antenna, and after a bit of experiment moved the direction of this antenna around and started making contact. I didn't do Morse myself, but I had a Morse key in my basher, my bedroom, and I used to communicate with another signaller further down in the barracks, and we used to rattle away. But we became very unpopular because everybody else had their little private radios, and all they heard when we were practicing, and we got a rather bad name, sadly. Those are the sorts of antennas we tried. The inverted V was the most successful. And we made contact all over the world. Sadly, I was not allowed to continue doing this. I was told to go back to Britain and become an officer. So Morse code, there was some voice, and the Brits used to speak in voice over the air. We had to use our predictions to apply the frequencies, and it was mainly the signals, the Brits that did that work. The Arab community, after we left, carried on, and that's Murad Hassam, the guy on the picture with me earlier, running an Arab radio station, and that is in the last 4 years. So if you can see that call sign there, A62END, if you make a note of that, try and contact him and tell him you've heard about him from me. That's our fort in Al Ain, out in the desert, beautiful building, and there are about 200 soldiers based there, with 3 British officers and a couple of communications and transport support people. Beautiful fort, and it's still there today. I was there a couple of years ago. I took my wife there, walked around, and it's a very impressive site. There's a little museum in there, so if you're ever there, do pop in and you'll see what it's about. Here you see the Arabs putting up dipoles. These are Clark masts, and Clark masts are known in this community, I gather, and have had a very long history. On commissioning, my first appointment was a trials squadron commander, and I was responsible for testing every bit of communications equipment. Generators, batteries, antennas, radios, digital pads, you name it, they came across my desk. And we had to test the operation. Did it meet the spec? How easy was it to use? The drop test, literally dropping it on the floor. Dropping equipment into a bucket of water to see that it met the spec. Heat tests, nuclear, biological and chemical warfare tests at the Admiralty Weapons Establishment at Harwell, and electromagnetic compatibility, that it didn't interfere with anything else. Very precise tests. And a report had to be written. I would sign it off, it would go to the trials director, and that report would be passed to the Ministry of Defence for that equipment to be approved and brought into service. Very detailed and exacting exercise. In the 1960s and 70s, the British radio was called Larkspur. It was VHF, HF, and some SHF. And that's the C11 R210. Then Klansman came in, and I'm sure many of you will have heard about Klansman, the first semi-digital radio. And then we moved to frequency hoppers. What a challenge that was. There was the Jaguar and the Scimitar. And I was tasked to do a trial on frequency hoppers because the scientists at the Royal Signals Radar and Communications Establishment in Malvern said, hey, there's a problem. Co-channel interference, harmonic interference etc., etc. Can you do a trial, John? Here's 100 scimitars, 100 jaguars. Develop a set of messages to be sent very regularly from each radio to other radios. And let's look at the impact of the electromagnetic environment, which is pretty crowded. We analysed the success and failed messages, and we produced a report to the MOD. That report gave the green light for frequency hoppers to be introduced to the British Army. A very exciting time. And those are the 5 issues that we assessed during that trial. Then came Ptarmigan, BT on wheels, a multi-node system, VHF, SHF, UHF radio relay, voice data facsimile, single channel radio access, and gateways. And those gateways were for operating with the Americans, the Germans, the French, no, not the French, they weren't working in NATO, the Belgians. And that was a very exciting time. I spent 4 months on Salisbury Plain, living in a tent, leading these trials. There was a management system within Ptarmigan called SCC, and we trialed that in UK and Germany. Then we did system level modifications to cater for components that were outdated. And I commanded a trial in Germany with 3,000 troops, 1,000 vehicles, to pull the heart out of Ptarmigan and put it back together. So we established a network of 28 nodes, all the supporting command vehicles and the mobiles. We carried out this trial. We established communications before modification. We pulled the piece apart and put it back together, and it worked. The biggest trial that I think the communications world has ever experienced. We did a further modification, first fielding to Germany, and all the vehicles were tested in Blandford by my team and sent to Germany and went operational straight away. The Americans saw Ptarmigan and thought, oh, we'd like one of those. So they ran a competition between France and the UK. France with a system called Rita and Ptarmigan from the UK. It was a 2-week trial. All the senior generals and procurers and scientists from America came over to Blandford. They pored over the system and they were very impressed. What impressed them was our soldiers. In a radio relay attachment, they would sit on a hill alone as a relay between other systems. And the Americans say, hey, guys, who does the antenna? I do, sir. Ah, gee whiz. Who does the cooking? I do, sir. Who does the guard? I do, sir. Who puts the antenna up? I do, sir. Who operates? I do, sir. They couldn't believe that 3 men could run a detachment doing all those things. For an American system like that, and I've seen it, there were 8 people. There was a cook, there was a guard. Amazing. The bids came in. Unfortunately, the French won. They underbid significantly. And to their despair, to the Americans' despair, downstream, they had to make modifications that cost them the difference between Ptarmigan and Rita. Very, very sad. There were questions in the House, there were questions in MOD, but that's a fact of life. You win some, you lose some. That's a Ptarmigan switch. This is back in '86. A digital switch, 512 channels, state of the art, like Concorde, years ahead of its time. But it worked, and it was a brilliant system. And not only did it work in Germany, it was taken to the First Gulf War and operated successfully in the desert. And that's great credit to the operators, but also to the manufacturers, Plessey Defence Systems in Christchurch. That's a radio relay detachment, UHF communications, elevated dish antenna. Now, my first meeting with John was when he was putting in place a commercial radio system for the RUC. A nodal system to cover the province that will give full area coverage. And Motorola were the contractors. And I went over to see John in my GCHQ role to talk about the security, the crypto for this radio. And he said, you know, I want various facilities. I want to be able to stun if we lose radios. I want to have remote key fill, etc., etc. And I said, yeah, okay, that's a big shopping list, but we'll do our bit in Cheltenham to see you get all of that. I went to Motorola, and I was talking to John just before this meeting, and I remember the name of the project manager in Motorola. And he said to me, well, some of the kit's going to be manufactured in China. Really? It's not. If we're putting UK crypto, UK eyes only crypto into that radio, everything must be UK owned and based. Yeah, okay. Well, we won that battle. We developed a crypto module for the Motorola device. It was passed over to John. He did the trials in the province. It worked. I think it's still there today, isn't it, John? Yeah. There you go. And that was a good example of reciprocal communications and willingness to get a system to work and to overcome some really serious hurdles. And GCHQ, who are the owners of UKI's code word, you name it, had to ensure that the crypto and the module and the environment was 100% secure. And we achieved that. I won't say anything more about that, but we did work for the Home Defence radio system in the UK, and that was deployed. And that was thousands of radios. Then Bowman came along, Klansman gone, Larkspur gone, Ptarmigan on the verge of going into the museum. And I had the privilege of, A, introducing Ptarmigan into service, but also putting it into the museum many years later. And I went down to Blandford to talk about the system and saw it go into the museum. And if you're ever in Blandford, go to the Royal School of Signals, to the museum. It's a fascinating display. Bowman, first fully digital radio in service now. And Bowman had a frequency hopper as well. Falcon took over from Ptarmigan, similar nodal system with single channel access, multinodal. Great success. And I was involved with Skynet, the Defence Satellite Communications System, still in service today and is worked in conjunction with other systems. But there are certain channels in that which cannot be shared with anybody and are appropriately protected by high-grade cryptography. Then we go to the nuclear side, and I was involved in that. In the weapon storage systems in Germany, for example, where nuclear weapons that are carried by aircraft are stored in special areas. And to get access to those weapons, they had to go through a sequence of coding to unlock doors and cabinets and stuff. And so I was involved in the development of the crypto for those systems. Submarines, cryptos in submarines, they have to be keyed, crypto keying, remote keying, trailing antennas from the rear end of the submarine, and sonar buoys. And the sonar buoys are uniquely and individually manufactured by Ultra Electronics, as was one of the companies I used to advise in my company. Fascinating area. And I don't know whether anybody's been on a Trident submarine. It's an amazing, amazing environment to think that people go down in that metal tube for 6 months and don't see the light of day, and providing our national deterrent. Extremely important, and long may we have that deterrent. So my time in GCHQ, I spent 10 years there. As I said, I'm not going to talk about signals intelligence. The name speaks for itself, but a very fascinating organisation. Protective security for the whole of government. In my time there, I was responsible for the interface between every government department for radio, for computer, for cryptographic modules, etc. I used to belong to various committees setting the policy for protective security. Key material production and distribution. Again, a very sensitive area that has to be fully protected. And this is where the human comes into the equation, to have properly vetted people to do that work. And I had the privilege of being DV'd, the highest clearance, for 48 years. Tempest. Tempest is not a big thing these days, but it's still necessary that equipment doesn't give emissions that can be captured and deciphered. ComSec monitoring. I had a little team that used to go to various places, including John's area, to monitor the radios, to monitor voice procedure, to ensure that people were operating properly. I was responsible for a team that did commercial crypto evaluations. Industry would come along and say, I've got a beautiful box. It's fully secure, and I'm going to sell it around the world. Yes, let's have a look at it. And we'd evaluate those modules and help get them to the right spec. Common criteria, I'm not going to dwell on that. It's an international evaluation criteria. And finally, interoperability. I was the national representative on the meeting of experts from the national security agencies. And that was a lovely group to belong to. The Five Eyes, Australia, America, New Zealand, UK, and Canada. And we met twice a year in one of those countries. And it was a privilege to experience regular trips to Australia and New Zealand. And I'd always tag on a few days holiday. And sometimes I would take my wife with me. And that was great. But we did actually work when we were in committee. And we established various crypto standards, interoperability standards, so that our nations could operate efficiently on the field. I left there in 2003, sadly. I did a world tour and set my own company up, and advising a lot of UK and US security companies, not just on crypto, but on radio procedures, the need for crypto, the need for the full security dimension for products and systems. I was a non-exec of 2 companies and a conference chairman. And I've chaired cyber conferences for one company for 19 years. My next one is November, and sadly it's going to be my last. At the age of 81, I think I've done enough. I've chaired 111 conferences for that company. It's time to hang my hat up and take my wife on more holidays. Does a career in RF communications appeal to you? And this is to the younger generation. You see this elderly gathering today. We need a follow-up to replace some of these people when they turn their toes up. And I hope, youngsters, I've given you an insight into a very exciting career, whether it be in the army, industry, or government. it is an exciting environment. Amateur radio offers a starting point, and all these happy people here talk regularly to each other. They talk in a language which some of you might not understand. It's their own voice procedure, but it is a very, very valuable environment. And they contribute to the development of communications, communications equipment right across the spectrum. And I commend that life to you. Get involved now. I'm an author of a book, and this is not a sell. I've got 6 copies here, which I'm happy to give away free to the first people that come and grab me. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you've enjoyed my experience, my Cook's tour of life in the communications. I think we have a few minutes for questions. I take that applause means there's no questions.
We met last night.
We did.
Thank you for that. It was very interesting. Sorry. Thank you for that, John.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, thank you for that, John. We met last night very briefly, and I told you I'd been in the RAF. You mentioned Tempest, which rang a bell with me when I was at Headquarters Strike Command. We just had the Air Staff Management Aid put in, which you may have heard of, and it was not tempested very well, and we could pick up signals in our married quarters, and obviously that was very dangerous. So it was interesting to hear that you were involved with that, and I don't know what the actual solution was, but it was after I got there that I'd heard about it, and it had all been cleared up by then.
AMS was subjected to a revalidation,
yeah.
And those emissions, a risk analysis was done on those emissions, and was there a threat to national sovereignty, and certain changes were made, I believe. But if you take a system like that and put it on the battlefield, where the enemy has got listening posts all over the place, it could be very damaging to our national security and our operational effectiveness.
Thank you, John. And may I have a request? In our club, we have a library. You know what I'm going to ask now, don't you? May I have one of your books, please?
You may.
Thank you.
I'll even sign it for you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Any others? Okay, I've come to the end of my time. Thank you. Oh.
Yes, I was wondering, thank you for your interesting talk. I was wondering, with your background with GCHQ and the communications from the Army military side, whether anyone is raising issues with BT, which I used to have a BT sort of background, closing down the analogue wired system, which to me is very resilient, and making us all civilians dependent on a mobile network.
My big hand, small answer to that is we move with the times. That is all power. Anywhere, anytime, any place. Do we need to expend money on great systems when it's all there and you can provide security for these things? It's all about economics today.
Is it secure?
Pardon?
Is it going to be very secure?
There are systems that are secure for global interoperability. That's not secure. Never will be. But there are secure phones used by government that do protect up to high levels of security. Do you want security? Who do you want to talk to at top secret?
Do you want a list?
Good one.
Thank you. John, although you point out the ubiquitous communications with cell phones, etc., those things are incredibly sensitive to the loss of a timing synchronization service. And 5G will not work if the timing system fails. So there are some very interesting new vulnerabilities to think about.
I accept that. I accept that totally. But we have to move with the times. And unfortunately, economics determine that movement and the speed of that movement and change.
Yeah, something I used to be very concerned about as well, because all our systems depended on timing. What happens when the timing, whenever GPS falls over,
Yep.
or the Yanks decide to switch it off?
Well, you could say the same about Microsoft.
Yes,
You know,
we do.
we all use it freely. But this is unfortunately where economics have pushed us aside a little bit. American, they lead. They lead on Apple. They lead on iPhones. They lead on computers, iPads, you name it. They've got the lead. They've got the revenue. And think about the money, the amount of money that we spend annually on American kit, and how much do they spend on UK kit?
Anyone else? I think our time is gone. John,
Thank
thank you
you
very much indeed, John.
Good to see you.